Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining today's session. So my name is Charles Allen, I'm a sales manager with OneTrust GRC, and I'm joined by my colleague, Alexander Funke, who is in the solutions engineering team with the GRC team. So today we're going to be spending an hour or so just going through well, first of all, a few of the challenges and the trends that we're seeing in the market with respect to GRC, predominantly IT and security risk. We'll then look at what the future of GRC looks like with respect to what customers and organizations are trying to achieve with their GRC activities. And then my colleague Alex will run through a very high-level overview of the OneTrust GRC environment, focusing primarily on the IT and security risk management module. So to start off with then, what we've seen over the past couple of years, and predominantly it's been sped up by activities and some of the impacts of the pandemic last year, really is a journey towards a more integrated approach to risk management. And what we tend to see, or what we have seen, is a lot of organizations at the moment are manually managing most of their aspects with respect to GRC through manual efforts, such as spreadsheets, sometimes SharePoint, but a lot of this is obviously quite manual. Some organizations have adapted certain tooling, so they use a combination of manual efforts plus other tools, and those can be tools to manage certain aspects of risk, policy management, or even tools to manage certain aspects of auditing too. So what we tend to find is that most organizations sit somewhere in between the two. No matter how mature they are, they tend to have some aspects that are automated, but really it's a combination of the two. What we have also seen, though, is a lot of organizations over time have invested in more complex custom solutions. And these can be more for the likes of enterprise risk management or the more all-encompassing GRC solutions. The problems with these, however, tend to be that they're generally quite large scale, expensive to implement, and also quite timely to implement as well. And some of them tend to be a little bit difficult to use when it comes to integrating and collaborating with the first line of the business. So again, what we've seen is then that a lot of organizations really are pushing towards a more integrated approach. And this naturally takes a lot of time in some instances, but also can save a huge amount of time when it comes to actually managing aspects of GRC in the long run. And doing so can bring about a number of different benefits. Obviously, there are a huge amount of them, but we've just highlighted a couple here. First and foremost, the ability to configure and automate workflows can bring about a number of efficiencies throughout the business in terms of time savings, but also the minimizing the amount of input needed when, for example, sending assessments to various members of the workforce. Equally, having a simple and easy to use interface tends to help boost engagement and collaboration with different lines of the business. And again, if we take the example of assessments, it's very easy to make sure that users or first line users of the business respond to assessments efficiently by giving them a much more easy and user-friendly interface to engage with. And then finally, the ability to centralize information brings about a much more visibility of risks, which helps organizations and security teams then maintain integrity and accuracy across the board. So again, these are just some of the key approaches, or I suppose the key benefits of an integrated approach to GRC. But obviously there are many more that we will highlight throughout the demo as well as we go through the OneTrust platform. So really then, how do organizations help? Now, OneTrust, for those of you who aren't aware, is one of the world's leading organizations or platforms to manage privacy, security, GRC, and data governance. So with over 7,500 customers around the world, we have helped both big and small enterprises with various aspects of basically trust. And in GRC in particular, obviously we'll go through some examples throughout as to how we help on a more operational level. For the business itself, then, we have over 1,500 employees, 40% of whom are actually allocated in the product research and development teams. And we obviously have very much a global scalability. And we tend to find this helps, especially with organizations who not only have requirements within the US or within Europe, but have a global regulations that they need to comply with, and therefore global processes that they're rolling out across the organization as well. So as I mentioned, today's demo will be focused primarily on the IT and security risk management module. And just as a real high-level overview, this is a tool that really helps organizations populate up-to-date inventories of their information and also the risk profiles associated with their assets and the processes that they're storing. We'll also go through how you can prioritize risk in real time with automated migration method or mitigation methods driven by AI risk triggers. We'll look at how organizations can use the tool to comply with confidence, utilizing automated evidence collection for assessments and also monitoring over time. Again, one of the areas we've mentioned already is collaborating with stakeholders. So we'll look at how you can simplify the first line engagements and track progress of assessments and tasks and other activities. We'll look at how you can reduce risk subjectivity by utilizing and standardizing risk assessments across the board. And then finally, we'll look at reporting risk within context to the organization itself by aligning risk to objectives and translating these to business processes as well. As well as this, we'll also cover off very briefly some of the integrations that are available within the platform. OneTrust itself is built on an open API framework, which allows you to leverage intelligent monitoring and automation across your IT network and stack. On your screen now, just a few examples that we've seen organizations and companies use across the board with respect to integrating with single sign-on, ITSM providers, as well as other tools as well to provide much more context to not only the systems you're using and storing within your platform, but also potentially the risks associated with them too. So hopefully that's been a relatively straightforward overview of what we're seeing in the market and OneTrust as a whole. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Alex to go through the platform in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Charles. We've talked about some of the theory. Let me show you now how we can realize some of those value adds mentioned. So welcome to OneTrust. This is our modular SaaS-first offering to implement an enterprise GRC. And to implement GRC, there's a few modules available, such as the IT risk management, which we'll be looking at in detail today. But we can move on to other areas from here, such as vendor risk, audit management, or enterprise policy management, because we acknowledge that every customer GRC journey is unique to their requirements. There's different regulatory frameworks, there's different jurisdictions with different ideas, different levels of maturity. So the way that you approach OneTrust, that you approach GRC in OneTrust is really up to you, because it's a system that really grows with you and that you never grow out of. To also cover some basics, there are a few mechanisms in place that are set up on an overall level, such as tying into your identity provider, for example, to seamlessly single sign on your users so that they do not have to add another username or password to their collection. And also we can tie into any org chart that the customer organization would have. So there's a hierarchy that that is set up to model the organization, and it can fit for small organizations, medium-sized businesses, as well as large corporates and large global enterprises using permissions and role-based access along this kind of org chart. For today's presentation, we'll be covering the IT risk overall life cycle. So we'll be looking at some of those integrations that Charles pointed out, where we connect to enterprise data and possibly discover assets, maybe find even rogue assets and shadow applications in our landscape. And then we see, once we have this central visibility, how we can measure and remediate risk, put controls in place, and then report on the entire framework. For example, to do a stakeholder reporting that is internal to an organization, or even to satisfy external regulatory requirements. So that's the overall process. And we're starting off with the first section, which is the connection of enterprise data. Within the asset inventory, and we're now in the IT risk management solution of OneTrust, the key inventory is really the asset view. So we have here coming together all applications, maybe even all IT resources that we have in the enterprise that matter in a GRC context, that matter for us to put a governance layer around them. So we probably see some applications that our employees use. We might even have physical elements or server elements, for example, physical data centers when we consider access control as security, or we might have servers that run our on-premise applications where we would look at all kinds of controls around hardening and operating those servers in a secure manner. But generally, the asset library is pretty agnostic to what type of asset you want to include. Today, we'll be looking at Adobe Analytics as an example, application that's used somewhere in the organization. Specifically, it's used within the marketing part of the enterprise. And where we see here on this master record, a lot of different information coming together. And this might be information that the business has contributed, such as why are they operating this asset? Why do they put in place this application in the first place? But also information that came from the IT, where we control out, okay, where it's hosted, what technical organizational measures are put in place to safeguard data on this asset. So everything comes here on this record. And this does not only mean that this is internal information that you manually entered or that your business departments have entered, but it could include information such as vulnerabilities that are brought over from your scanning system, from a Tenable, for example, where we connect to a feed of vulnerabilities. And if there's maybe a high number of unpatched vulnerabilities that haven't been remediated for a couple of days, they pop up here in OneTrust in relation to the same asset record, so that you at least from a GRC side govern this and initiate those steps. But it's really the benefit of business information, the business context coming together with IT details on a single record. And we talk a lot about that as we go along. This asset database, it's quite extensive. So you might have a lot of different assets, asset classes in your enterprise. So you can filter different views on this data. So we might have a view that only shows you applications and other views that shows you your physical perimeter and assets. But regardless of the number, we give you very easy options to interrogate this data, such as changing the views, as you've just seen, filtering the data, and it also ties into the organizational context. So if I were to dive into maybe the HR department of our model enterprise that we're looking at today, I see only those HR assets. And the view that you have here now also mimics the view that maybe an HR employee has that's responsible for IT within HR. So we can give information to them so that they have an overview of what are the assets that they're using, that they make sure that they register any assets that they actually work with. So confirming completion, completeness of this list that they see here. So really to delegate out some of, not the responsibility, but some of the information into the enterprise, into the business departments, again, with the objective to make sure we have a complete inventory, that we govern any IT application that the business is using to avoid any kind of rogue or shadow applications being used that we do not have a control over. There is a few ways to populate this vendor record, so we can tie into common integrations, common systems, such as a ServiceNow, for example, which is a standard integration that you could trigger out of OneTrust. And there's plenty of other examples that we provide where we read information from another system, or when we maybe populate back assessment information back into a central CMDB kind of system. But we really have the idea that OneTrust is the central point where on a manageable level, on the governance level, all information comes together. Again, business, IT, knowledge consolidated. We can also upload this data via spreadsheets. We can have the business self-service input this data. So there's plenty of options to get to a fully built out enterprise record. The next step would be to not just talk about governance, but really implement governance. So to run assessment, maybe to do a business impact analysis on our asset, to determine confidentiality, integrity, availability requirements, how much impact would a downtime have to our business, to our customers, to our regulators? So how critical are our assets? So that would be a BIA that we'd run. And then we connect this BIA with the controls that we want to put in place. So assuming that a critical asset of our enterprise, we probably have a very high security baseline, tying into probably more than one control framework. So how can we put this in place? We support you with through a couple of features. The one is a control library that we have built out based on a lot of major standards that we see globally being used. Here in Europe, it might be the ISO 27000 as an InfoSec management system. In the US, there are a couple of NIST standards. And there's plenty of others from derived from frameworks and jurisdictions globally to help you build out your framework. There's also Athena, our artificial intelligence engine that will, along the way, give you some recommendations. So for example, if you missed a control that is actually quite popular, or that should be used based on this the machine's suggestion, it will speak out and say, okay, maybe there's a control that you've missed, or you find related controls that you can reuse from other frameworks. And this is some of the features that you have. And this is what it would look like in OneTrust. So you have a controls library, which determines sort of top-down the controls that you have, maybe also called global controls or baseline controls. And you see them all here. They come from standards that you activate, from frameworks that you activate, and you find here in this list that we provide many, many out of the box. And once you've taken them over from this library onto your personal shelf of books, of frameworks, they sit here in the library and can be used by the business. So if we later then remediate asset risk or implement control baselines on maybe an application level, we can choose, mix, and match from this library. Since this might be a very extensive library, we can easily filter by framework, as I've done here, but we could simply remove this selection and maybe filter for a different framework or standard that we either have from the standard frameworks or which you populated based on internal frameworks that you have within the organization. So we can also easily incorporate your custom data. And then once we have those controls, they sit in the library and they're ready to be used. How do we determine which controls we do actually want to use? So we take a step back and see how how exposed, how risky our assets are. So we're taking a risk-based approach towards measuring risk and then deriving controls in the next step. And we can do so in a couple of levels of, let's say, granularity or levels of maturity, where we can work with a simple one-dimensional risk score, which is a 4-point scale, or we can detail it out into a heat map that we build along likelihood and impact dimensions. And it can be 4x4, 5x5, and we can tweak the parameters, and we can tweak a lot more, such as the aggregations and so on. But the output will always be that we have consistent, robust risk information that allows us to compare assets, to put in place the correct baseline of controls for those assets. And when we do this frequently over time, for example, in a quarterly or yearly cadence, we also see the risk exposure changing over time. This is the heat map that we can configure in the tool. And that's a very good example of how we truly are a next-gen GRC solution that makes not only these configuration options available to IT and tech-savvy technical users, but really where we provide tools that business users, IT-savvy users easily can understand, configure, and then leverage and operationalize. And this heat map is a great example. And as you've just seen me doing, I've sort of cut down the 5x5 heat map to 4x4 levels. I could also tweak the risk band here slightly and maybe introduce a risk score of 3 here along either the blue or yellow band, which is low or medium risk. So easy as that, I can configure and tweak my heat map. Once this is saved, it will be applicable for all risk scorings I do from this point onwards. So when we assess risk in a couple of minutes, you will see this methodology being applied. So where often there is quite a bit of work to get to a robust risk methodology, I think we have all the pieces here built in. You can just tweak them to your liking and then really start using them. The risk scoring, the control frameworks, that really allows for really quick implementations. When we talk about implementations, there's also a degree of customization you might want to do. So we looked earlier at an asset record, Adobe Analytics, but you will find that, okay, I have this specific field that I'm currently tracking in my CMDB or in my asset master list. So we not want you to lose this information because you can easily create additional fields on objects in OneTrust. So here, if I want to add an additional field, I can quickly go in, and maybe this is the previously evaluated governance level, so maybe a baseline governance level that you want to apply on a certain asset. And this would be either a text field, a single select, multi-select, and there's a few other fields available. So if we would make this a single select, the options could be high, medium, or low for me to fill this out and add this to the record. So as we then tie into your data, whatever form this data makes in, we make sure that you do not lose everything because we make space for your data, for your fields and attributes first, like this. And then when we load the data, we make sure that your specific governance level in this example is being populated. Another perfect example of quick implementation, quick configuration, resulting in much shorter project life cycles and really quick wins and a fast value add. So now when we start identifying risks, we've established the context with which assets we're actually evaluating. Now let's see how we actually can determine, identify a set of risks. And we can run classical risk assessment, and I'll show you an example of that in just a bit. We can do technical monitoring, where maybe an integration with your Tenable drives certain risks being created, but they could also be derived from incidents that we have ongoing in our day-to-day IT ops, and where those incidents help us conclude better or help us understand our risk better. So if there's maybe a spike in data breaches in relation to a certain asset class, this might be an additional risk that we want to track, remediate, and eventually fix. So incidents, tying incidents into our risk process is really one of the most valuable sources because what's actually happening drives the risk assessment. It's not just the subjective judgment of the risk assessor, but it's really the facts, the day-to-day circumstances that are happening in the organization that help me make a better risk assessment decision. And then there's also regulatory feeds, external notifications, and also where we have self-reported risks, maybe coming from whistleblowing processes or others. So there's a lot of sources of risks, and we auto-consolidate all of those. When we look at risk assessments, we provide you with lots of templates that you can use. And this is a very common one, which is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the CSF. And it's popular because it's much shorter than, for example, the 853 standard, but it also covers main areas that we might want to measure. So here we see this assessment asking about whether the organization inventorizes assets, in this case, physical devices and systems. And we see that this control that we're checking for from a CSF perspective is also mapped to many other standards. So while assessing here once, we might answer the requirements of many different type of regulations. And if we were to now say that, okay, this is really good to have, such as a CSF out of the box as a template among the 100 templates, but my organization is specific. And probably all of your organization are a bit specific because you have your own crown jewels to protect. So that's where you can easily amend any assessment, change any assessment using this very powerful assessment builder. So you might have an additional baseline section here that you want to add to your assessment. And then you maybe have a question that you drag in here, maybe in your control assessment questions that you add to the questionnaire, which then is to be filled out and drives your risk assessment. because those answers that you give here, they can also be translated to risks. So where a certain condition or set of conditions is met in the questionnaire, an inherent risk of medium should be automatically proposed because there's a certain gap in the management system. Now let's look at how this shows to the user. So we set up our templates, we set up our questionnaires. You can have as many as you like, and they're really easy to configure. So how do we use them? So on our assets, we would run assessments, and they would present to the user in a way like this, that they're sent out to me, maybe as the system owner who knows the system in depth. And I now provide asset information on why is this asset being used. I provide threat information, what are typical threats that I'm seeing this asset being faced with. And this is a nice example of a good question that is well described, that has meaningful answer options that are super easy for me to understand and fill out as someone who knows this asset. And once I fill out this questionnaire, it will go into a review state. And in the review state, we look at risk. Now you have maybe a lot of assessments that you run, and maybe different assessments based on what type of asset you're looking at. And there might be even extended assessments where you look at your third parties, maybe where you assess your ISMS for a certain scope area. So you're assessing pretty much departments or the maturity in your enterprise. So you can have as many assessment types as you like. And the system can help you automate sending out those assessments. So you don't have every quarter, every year check, okay, what are now the 50 assessments I need to send out? No, you can define easy rules that drive triggers that trigger those assessments. And it's not like, again, that you need to be a technical user who creates a formula or sets up a regex or something really complicated. No, you can very easily model rules that drive assessments. Here we say, okay, if the asset discovery has not been completed in 60 days and the asset is very high and high, then send an additional assessment to discover additional information about an asset. And other examples would be that, okay, maybe we are reviewing every of our medium assets every 3 years and our high risk assets every year, as a re-review to confirm the baseline of protection. And there's plenty of assessment options that you have. And these easy to configure rules really allow you to operationalize what you're doing today, probably in spreadsheets, emails, and manually. Now, once an assessment comes back to you, and let's stick to this example that you received this assessment back in an email, in an Excel, what do? You probably need to go in and do the same things all over again that you're doing for the last 30 assessments, looking at certain question-answer pairs and determining risk from that. But OneTrust can help you do that because as you review this assessment, where answers have come back about a certain asset, OneTrust will flag those risks automatically that it finds in this assessment. So as you see here, we have 4 risks actually being flagged, and they belong to certain question or certain questions being answered in this assessment. So I can see that I have an elevated risk of function compromise, error in usage, and it ties back to a question in the questionnaire where the user has filled out, okay, we see sometimes that the users don't use the system correctly and circumvent controls maybe. So that's why we have this risk flagged by OneTrust, and we can now go into a more detailed evaluation, treatment, and monitoring of this risk, should we choose to accept it. This is not the only function that you can do in the review. You can also collaborate in a fantastic manner back with your counterpart, the person who's provided you with this assessment. So you can send back the entire questionnaire. So if maybe the quality is not correct, and then you send it back with a comment that there's really rework required. Or you can, and that's the preferred option, send back additional questions, maybe where you ask for evidence, for a certificate, for a certification that helps the responder prove that something is being met. So you can collaborate on a question by question basis in what we call information requests. And this has the fantastic advantage that as you use this question by question collaboration. You only maybe send back 1 or 2 questions, but you can already proceed with the interpretation of everything else that sits in this questionnaire. So you're not losing any time while you're evaluating your assets in this case. These risks that we have identified, they end up in a risk register, and there's a asset-specific view. So here we're looking at Microsoft OneNote, the popular note-taking application, and see, okay, there's a few risks associated. And we show those risks in 3 levels of detail: individual risk levels, aggregated categories, and the overall score that we now have in place for OneNote. And the score is high because really the security of the system came back as with a high risk level. In a more meaningful setup, it would probably be a more confidential type of requirement, because OneNote is not a system that has the utmost availability requirements, not so much integrity because it's all unstructured, but confidentiality is probably very important. So some of my customers, they choose to align their risks along CIA, the CIA triad, so that they can always see, okay, which of their assets have high confidentiality requirement. For example, what customers would be putting into OneNote versus maybe more available systems where we maybe process payment cards because we otherwise could not handle our customers. So there's a lot to see here on the screen. Again, 3 levels of risk: individual risk level, categories, and aggregated risks. And of course, this can be your methodology, where we even can tweak the methodology if you want to do a max, a min, a sum, an average, or a count of risks. And of course, these categories you can build out along with the categories that you typically track. Having talked about risk, there might be external risk triggers, and also that ties into the slide of Charles earlier, where he mentioned that your information has a lot of, that your organization has a lot of information in a lot of IT expert systems. And again, a VM scan, a log processor, or some maybe code scanner would be examples, things from your DevOps cycle. So this can feed into OneTrust, and we use again our Athena AI and robotic process automation platform for that. So for example, if there's a tenable high vulnerability scan being completed, resulting in a high vulnerability, we can have OneTrust automatically add the vulnerability to the library and then have a risk identified that's prompted immediately for the risk owner or the asset owner to respond to. And you can model those integrations very easily in OneTrust, where you have a trigger, such as a frequency or a webhook. Then you talk to the API endpoint of any system that you talk to. In this case, it's just a mock-up example. And then you determine what you do in OneTrust, such as putting this maybe into the inventory and creating a risk. And this is fully modeled using our workflow builder, which covers internal workflows, external workflows. And again, you don't need any additional tooling because it's all built in. So you don't need to set up an external ETL. You don't need to put Pentaho on the application server and broker between different APIs. You can all do it from this web platform. And I find my customers, they put integrations in here that we as OneTrust don't even learn about, because they learn it quickly and then they use it to their best knowledge. Having now sources of risks covered, and this could be internal sources, external sources, we might want to remediate those risks to eventually either have an exception for risks. It's actually quite popular that risks are accepted for maybe for the next year and then revisited, or ideally they're reduced or removed overall. But in either way, we want to continuously monitor. When we look at a detailed risk level, which we're in now, also we're in a detailed risk record, where there is a certain risk that has been identified, again, from our OneNote asset. We see that it's currently in the evaluation stage. So we're determining, okay, what is the inherent risk level for this risk? And you might already set a target risk level, where we say, okay, eventually we want to go to a low level on the medium near term. And as we proceed to the treatment, we sketch a treatment plan, assign ownership, accountability for this treatment plan, and then we might put in place a couple of controls. And here we see, okay, these controls that we added from the library that we earlier talked about, we can mix and match those controls. And we have full clarity here on which controls are being done, which are maybe not applicable because they're not needed in this reduction, and then also which are still pending. And these are the two that I've just added. So we might make sure that we document the control owner so that we properly laid out accountability. Having done that, we move the risk into monitoring, where we can say that we reduce the risk by implementing controls, and say that we maybe already achieved that medium risk that we targeted for earlier. And that concludes sort of an individual risks life cycle. We looked at these controls that we put in place on a risk, and sometimes just documenting the control and assigning ownership is not enough. Because what we can actually do is to operationalize and monitor controls that we have put in place. So first, a control record is also extensible. So this is our standard layout, but all my customers, they put additional fields here on whether the control is preventive detective, on whether it's an IT general control or process control, a transactional control, and so on. So there's often a lot more information, but the controls that we provide out of the box, they come with a name, a status, a framework reference, and a description. They're quite insightful in that regard. As we have then controls put in place, we see the overall status. So here we see that, okay, Jonathan Looney actually implemented this control and it's provided this information back into the system, which is good. But we still have some gaps in terms of documentation that we would need to work on. Once we filled out all this documentation, we might still not be there because we don't want this to be a one-time activity where the control owner acknowledges this control one time, but we might want to, on a certain frequency, self-assess this control. So after describing and maybe localizing a control, maybe localization to make it specific to a certain asset, maybe specific to a certain jurisdiction or certain language. So I see my customers even translating their key controls on the local level into something that, the local owners understand. After you've done that and documented the local control implementation in detail, you can proceed to say that, okay, this control is not only there, but you have to review it monthly. Another terminology would be you have certified to it monthly, you would need to test it monthly. But the activity that then happens every month or every quarter or every year that the controller has tasked to perform is a questionnaire where the controller goes over the key operational aspects of this control, certifies that it's actually working effectively, or it's first designed effectively and then working effectively. And to prove that, they can also attach any kind of documentation back into the system, maybe a screenshot, maybe some other detail that they want to add to eventually prove to your back to the ISMS, to the IT management system, to prove to the auditors, to prove to external regulators if there's maybe a breach later on, that their control effectiveness is in place and that the evidence is fully satisfied. So the more detailed I do this here, the more information we have later to prove our state of the ISMS, and the more the auditors have to review and not have to redo as they evaluate from a third line of defense perspective. Last, through all the activities that we've seen, we want to keep track of what's going on. We want to provide those reports that help us prove our accordance with requirements, etc. That's where we have lots of reports available. We have diagrams. You can get all the information out in exports. And we have interactive dashboards, which I will show you first. Those interactive dashboards come out of the box, but you can have as many variants of those as you'd like. So if you want to cater for different stakeholder groups that have certain information needs, you can serve them with their own dashboard variant. You can then help them that they get oversight of their assessments, oversight of their risk, their assets, their issues, and so on. And everything they see is interactive. So if they were to drill down into issues that are currently being evaluated. They can click on these charts and then dive into the detailed record of the situation to find more. These dashboards are also configurable by users, by end users, by key users. I could, as a user, configure my own dashboard without relying on my IT to serve me up with another dashboard. Because what we offer here as configuration functionality is quite straightforward, quite easy to use, not more complicated than generating a chart in Microsoft Excel, for example. So I could go in, change the data points, change the presentation of the data, then say if it's a half screen part of the dashboard or a quarter screen, maybe move those elements around, save them off with a filter and a name, and easy as that, I maybe have a new dashboard, such as maybe relevant IT assets protecting my physical perimeter. Yeah, this is an example of a dashboard that you could build with a certain pieces of information filtered for all your maybe access control camera, CCTV, and so on. So very, very specific things can then very easily at the same time be configured. Last, we have all this resulting in risks. So all risks come together in a risk register. And also here I can have different perspectives on risks, maybe risks tied into my ISMS, risks coming from vendors, risks coming from assets, maybe external risks. And again, those views that I'm switching here between, you can fully customize those, have as many variants as you like, so that you really have the right information at your fingertips. Details can also be produced in exports, such as this PDF report. We're producing a report about an asset's risk exposure, where we have in one screen, in one report, not only the risk levels, the risk information, but also detailed information about how the controls are implemented, how well they're tracking, how their recent maturity has been assessed. So everything comes together to give an overview about my asset. And this is a report along with other reports that we can build in OneTrust, where you have a template that you configure to your liking, and then you can have OneTrust send out this questionnaire to your stakeholders. So even stakeholders who might not log on to the application on a weekly basis, you can serve them with reports, because we can put reports on schedules where this report is pushed out to the information owners, to the process owners, to the system owners, the people who need to have this information. The last report type is a spreadsheet report. We've just seen the PDF. The spreadsheet report is often used to benchmark maybe multiple assets, to summarize the information that we collected in an assessment, to maybe match and mix controls. So we have one control satisfying many requirements. This is the report that would provide clarity. And I could export this report out in an Excel format, so I can do follow-up analysis outside the system. Last, when we now extend our IT risk management into a more process views, so you might want to look at not only your assets overall, but you might want to collect them into the business processes, the processing activities that actually exist for the purpose of representing your business to generate your revenue. So your business processes can be modeled in OneTrust as processes. You can tie those assets, entities, vendors that you work with into this process. And then you can have even OneTrust map out some of the relationships that we've built out. So in this case, we look at an event and trades show process, where we are processing customer information. It's stored in a system that's called IT Central. We have a vendor here working on the system as well. We see where this information is being stored and processed, and where it's actually being used and consumed by other users. So this is an automatically drawn picture of a data flow based on the information that we have. And again, that ties into the information we collected at the very beginning, where we build out our asset register, and where we, in populating this asset register, also started thinking about, okay, what kind of data do we process, who is supporting us, such as external vendors, and also who internally or externally is actually receiving, has access to this data. And this is a perfect representation that I can go to my business with and say, okay, is this really your process? And then they can really point out, okay, we are also having this system. Why do I not see this in this chart? And then you've discovered another IT shadow system that you were not previously aware of. So that's where many of the things that we've done tie together, including the residual risk, which is also indicated here along the process chart. So to show how risky is now a process to someone who's not an IT or asset owner, this is the perfect presentation, because you can demonstrate, in this case, to your marketing team, okay, hey, marketing, this is your process, but you have risks all over the place. We need to work on that. And with those words, I've conclude my presentation and wish you a very nice day.
Thank you very much, Alex. So just to wrap up, obviously, hopefully everybody's found that a useful session, not only understanding what OneTrust does as an organization, but also how the platform can help with respect to cybersecurity and also IT security risk as well. So just to recap, we covered off quite a few things within the short demo, specifically around the IT and security risk management module under the OneTrust GRC platform. But if you want to see more or would like to request a demo of your own or even a free trial of the platform, please do visit the OneTrustGRC.com. There are a number of pages on the website for you to obviously log a request for a demo. Equally, please feel free to reach out to myself or Alex on LinkedIn, or also follow OneTrust GRC on LinkedIn as well, where we not only provide constant information, white papers, knowledge sharing sessions, but also can obviously answer any calls or reach out to you that way as well. Thank you for your time, and we hope to speak to a few of you very soon.